Schoeniger for probably 20, 30 years. He used to attend Ohio Venture Association meetings. And then I saw periodically on the internet that he was educator and what would we say, source of inspiration to entrepreneurs. And then more recently I read about his book about the entrepreneurial mindset, and I called Gary and I said, Gary, you're going to tell us about, I was going to say Elon Musk, but I won't. You're going to tell us about Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and whatnot. And he told me about his own entrepreneurial vision or experience, his own entrepreneurial adventure, and what his thesis was. And I grabbed his book, and I found it to be a source of inspiration. I would commend it to all of you. And I think, frankly, to me, the thing I found most interesting that I want to ask Gary about is how do we support all of the entrepreneurs in our midst. So without further ado, let me introduce Gary Schoeniger.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. So I always cringe when people introduce me as a motivational speaker. I'm not that guy. Just saying, not trying to be Tony Robbins. Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me here, Ben. I've been on this journey for since 1991. What is that? That's a long time. I can't do math in public. 34 years. And I'm from Mentor, by the way. Trying to really answer one simple question, which is, how do underdogs win? How do people that have nothing create something? And the short answer is they're all entrepreneurial. They don't necessarily own the business, but they're entrepreneurial. You can own a business and not be entrepreneurial, and you can be entrepreneurial and you not own the business. I want to make that really, really clear straight out. And so, I became fascinated with this idea of the entrepreneurial mindset. What is it about? Like, how do underdogs win? How do people that have nothing, how do they identify opportunities that the rest of us overlook? How do they mobilize resources and make things happen when they don't have access to, they don't have big ideas, they don't have MBAs, they don't have access to resources? So I went on this journey to try to figure that out, thinking that this might be able to help people, and not just people who want to start a business, but there's a way of thinking here that could empower anyone. And I will see if this is true, but I've interviewed 700 entrepreneurs now all over the world. I just got back from interviewing entrepreneurs in Cameroon and West Africa, which is poverty next level. And very often when I'm done interviewing entrepreneurs, they're kind of stunned to realize that they're actually following a predictable pattern of beliefs and behaviors because they're not really aware of it. And one of the things I say to entrepreneurship educators, and I spend a lot of time in universities training faculty how to teach entrepreneurship. And one of the ideas I'd like to point out is that of 700 entrepreneurs, I could count on a butcher's left hand the number of them that had any formal training in entrepreneurship. So are we creating entrepreneurs? Are they becoming entrepreneurial in spite of or because of is the question, right? But I think there's a bigger idea here, which is, we all understand the economic value of entrepreneurial activity. That's not controversial, right? We understand that entrepreneurs are the engines of our economy. They're creating jobs, solving problems. But what we don't realize is that our systems of education are producing non-entrepreneurs. We're mass producing employees. And if I wanted to invent a system that would systematically suppress the entrepreneurial spirit, I can think of no better system than public education, than standardized education. I was at a talk last night at Case. There was a guy there, a New York Times guy from Silicon Valley named Kevin Kroom. He writes about AI. He's got a book out called Future Proof. And it just sort of solidified a lot of my thinking around this, that you know, if you're relying on other people to teach you how to be useful, you're going to become increasingly irrelevant very, very quickly. If you are caught up in, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, like these top-down hierarchical learning systems, top-down hierarchical managerial systems are ill-suited to a hyper-connected global AI world. And the people who are thinking like employees, and they don't know they're thinking like that, people come up to me all the time and say, Gary, tell me exactly what is an entrepreneurial mindset. Just get to the point. And I need a little bit of runway to explain that, right? So my snarky answer is, well, geez, why don't you just tell me what a non-entrepreneurial mindset is? And then I'll just wait, because that really answers the question, right? So I think we're living in this time right now that this huge transition is happening. And people that cannot figure out how to make themselves useful to other humans without the guidance of another are going to get flattened by the AI world. I was on a webinar last Friday from 2 Harvard scholars who wrote a book called Employment is Dead. We're living in the most opportunity-rich time in human history is happening right now. But opportunities, I wrote this in the book, opportunities are everywhere. They're not hard to find, they're easy to overlook. They're latent, and they can't be seen with a managerial mind. Now, let me just back up. Okay, so I started on this journey in 1991 trying to figure out, the entrepreneurial mindset. How is it different from a non-entrepreneurial mindset? Why do some people think this way and others don't? I've scoured the literature. Psychologists have for decades tried to correlate entrepreneurial behavior with dispositional traits, and the correlation is very, very weak. And so I went on this journey, and I'll just fast forward. I started interviewing entrepreneurs. There wasn't a lot of literature back then. I started interviewing local entrepreneurs. I started reading like the biographies of Henry Ford and all that, and it's like, okay, that's interesting, but what is the everyday entrepreneur doing? Fast forward 2008, I got hired by the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in San Jose, California, to do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education ecosystem in North America. And it was very, very obvious very quickly that the way entrepreneurship is being portrayed in the classroom is divorced from the reality of what a typical entrepreneur is actually doing. Newsflash, they're not writing business plans, right? So Cisco, I came back to Cisco with this and they said, well, what are they doing? And I said, I've got some anecdotal ideas from my own experience with my friends and so forth, but there's no research out there. There was some research, it started to pop up, but there wasn't a lot. So Cisco gave me a platform. I was telling Wyndham this. Cisco gave me a platform to go across the United States and interview 200 everyday entrepreneurs. At first, I just started hearing crazy stories. You can try this yourself, right? You go sit down with an entrepreneur, you're going to hear some winding, crazy, all over the place story. But, after 20 or 30 of these interviews, I started to recognize common, predictable patterns of underlying beliefs and assumptions of which the entrepreneurs themselves were largely unaware. That this mindset was the missing link, right? And I now realize, it took me a while to figure this out, but like I was going about this as an anthropologist. If I asked this guy, how'd you start your first business? He's going to tell me I borrowed $5,000 from my mother-in-law 20 years ago, worked my ass off and screwed up all over the place, and now I got this thing going. And, well, how'd you do that? Well, I love what I do. I never gave up. I worked really hard. I never gave up. Well, it's not that useful. I'm working really hard too, right? It's not really that useful. You got to dig. You got to dig. And I kept coming up with these common, what I now realize are cultural themes. Like entrepreneurs are like a subculture, right? So one of the entrepreneurs I interviewed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I went to Tulsa to interview a blind guy that started a television company for blind people after he lost his eyesight at the age of 29. All right? And I'll tell you that story on another day if you had me back. So, amazing story, right? You know what the guy told me? He said, losing my eyesight taught me how to see. Whoa. You know what that is? It's what psychologists call an optimistic explanatory style, which is we now know is the underlying cause of resilience. It's optimism. I've never met a pessimistic entrepreneur in my life. Never. Now, you can teach yourself to be optimistic. It has less to do with your traits and more to do with the goal you're pursuing and your relationship to that goal. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, I'm in Tulsa. I got the film guy with me, and we're not flying out till the next day. I said, we're not going to knock off at noon. We're entrepreneurs, right? I'm going to go find some other entrepreneurs. Walked into a coffee shop, asking perfect strangers, do you know any entrepreneurs? I mean, what the hell else are you going to do in Tulsa, right? And this guy comes in, and this is clamshell days, so you can't be Google searching people on the fly, right? This is 2008. This guy said, oh yeah, this guy Clifton Talbert, he goes to my church. He's one of the founders of Stairmaster, the exercise company. And I said, well, that sounds interesting. You got his number? And he goes, yeah. So he dials up his number, hands me a little clamshell, I'm standing in line at Starbucks. Guy said, I said, hi, Mr. Talbert, my name's Gary. I'm doing this research for Cisco. I'm only in town today. Is there any way we can come to your office and do an interview? He said, yeah, why don't you come at like 4 o'clock at the end of the day, let me get most of my day done and show up at 4. And so we showed up at 4, and I got the film guy. We had way more crew, we're dragging trunks with, all this equipment. We walk in his office, and all I knew at the time was that he was part of Stairmaster. We walk into his office. It looked like a well-appointed attorney's office. Reception is at the front. I found out later it was his wife. And Clifton was he was 65 at the time, I think, 64, 65. And he said, wait a minute, who are you and what did I agree to? I had to explain it all over again, Okay, we're going to do this interview. Got him down in the corner. I got a little video of this on the internet if you find it. Got him sign a talent release. We're doing this research. Sit down over in the corner where there's a plant, And I got the camera guy over my shoulder, and my first question to him, which I often use as the first question, tell me how you got on your entrepreneurial journey. Did somebody push you in the pool? Did you wade in the pool? Do you feel like you were born that way? Like, what was it? And I'll never forget this. Clifton kind of looked off in the middle distance, and he said, long before this word entrepreneur became popular, the concept still existed. And he explained to me that he was born in the Mississippi Delta in 1945 to a teenage mother in a poor cotton community. Clifton's African American. And that he was born a single mom, no dad in his life. He was living with his relatives. And he said, for people that look like me, the future was in the fields. He said, Mr. Walter's field truck came every morning at 6. And you got on the field truck. And you went out and you picked cotton. There was no advancement. There was no good job. You're getting a raise or you're going to move up the ladder. You pick cotton and that was it. And he's a storyteller, and he told me what it was like to be a 13-year-old boy. He drew out on a napkin for me later, like a flatbed truck with benches and a canopy over it. And the little boy and the older people are grumpy, and he's up under their feet, and they're kicking at him, and their breath, and this was the way of life. He said this is the expected way of life. And he said there was cotton in all directions. For as far as I could see, it was cotton. And he said, but there was one guy, he said it was my Uncle Cleve, that taught me how to think like an entrepreneur. And he pulled this picture, a black and white photograph out of a shoebox. And he said, this is the guy that taught me how to think like an entrepreneur. And now the hair on the back of my neck is standing straight up, and I'm looking over my shoulder at the camera guy like, is your shit working? Because something's going down, right? And he started to explain there was something different about my uncle. He walked differently. He was the only guy in our town that had money in the bank. And every 2 weeks, we went to the bank and they wouldn't let us in the front door. We had to go in the back door. And he's talking about this little 13-year-old boy walking into this big, intimidating institution where he's not welcome, and watching his Uncle Cleve pull his passbook, you guys don't even know what that is, out of his bib overalls and put it underneath the teller window, and the teller makes sure not to touch his hands. Right? But his money was in the bank. And he said Uncle Cleve had a 4th grade education, but he had books in his truck. And he was reading. And he would go over and talk to Mr. Friedman, the grocer. That was his little network. He hung around with other entrepreneurs. Right? He was selling coal and firewood in the winter months. He was fixing high-dollar cars. He saved his money. He was buying rental properties, right? This is a guy with a 4th grade education. So long story short, I convinced Clifton to write a book with me called Who Owns the Ice House? 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur. We published that book in 2010. We went to the Kauffman Foundation, developed a curriculum around these 8 core concepts that's now gone all over the world. I've trained thousands of educators on 5 continents. Hundreds of thousands of students have been through this Ice House Entrepreneurial Mindset program. Right now, we're in the middle of a partnership with a foundation in South Africa, the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation. 10,000 career and technical education teachers are being trained to teach the Ice House Entrepreneurship program in South Africa right now as we speak. And that really was, now, okay, that's that. Almost immediately, we were at the Kauffman Foundation. We launched the program in 2011. People started showing up to go through our training to become facilitators of this content. And people started showing up from Harvard and Stanford and Yale and coming from all over the world to come to this training. And you know what imposter syndrome is, right? You got to do this shit scared sometimes, right? I was waiting for one of these Harvard types to start telling me, like, point out flaws in my thinking. And the opposite kept happening. They kept showing up saying, you're onto something, you're onto something, you're onto something, right? And I realized almost immediately now this was sort of anecdotal, but I needed to do a deeper dive. And so I started to study the literature. I started to look deeper. Why are some people behaving this way? Why aren't others? Like, what exactly is this entrepreneurial mindset? And I started to look at research in sociology and psychology and behavioral economics and really do a deeper dive to understand the entrepreneurial mindset. And look, here's what I like to say to folks. I would forgive you if you were walking by this book in the airport or in a bookstore and you look at that subtitle, the hidden logic that unleashes human potential. I would forgive you if you thought that was hyperbole. But I challenge you to read that book and you'll see that it's not. And what I've discovered, and I'd like to engage in a dialogue with you, But what I've discovered is a dimension of human potential that very few human beings have ever seen. You guys know what the overview effect is? You know what that is? It happens to astronauts. It's a psychological phenomenon that happens to astronauts. When they're in outer space and they look back at Earth and the fragility of this little blue ball hanging out there, when they return to Earth, they abandon their positions as astronauts and they become involved in humanitarian efforts. They realize the folly of wars and famine and, right? That's kind of what's happened to me as a result of interviewing all of these everyday entrepreneurs. There is this vast reservoir of untapped human potential that we cannot get to with top-down hierarchical learning. It can't be measured with academic achievement scores or IQ tests. You know, I was giving a talk in Dallas a couple weeks ago, actually in December, at the Pegasus Center, which was funded by the big biotech center in Dallas, funded by the Hunt family. And there was the biotech people were all there. And I was talking about, you know, this work. And a guy came up to me, an MD came up to me afterwards, and he said, you know, and he was kind of looking at me like this. He goes, you know, there's a guy here in Dallas who's a billionaire. And I'm pretty sure he's functionally illiterate. I said, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I just met a barista in the airport who's got a master's degree. Right? There's a different dimension of human potential that we can't get to with our current way of thinking, with top-down, with the managerial logic of the last century. You just can't see it. There's a joke, you know, among entrepreneurs. The A students wind up teaching B students how to work for the C students, right? That's kind of how it goes. As an aside, you know, so I got invited to Harvard to give a book talk in December about my new book. I have a high school diploma, barely. I spent high school years smoking weed. If it wasn't for wood shop, I'd be working at Home Depot right now, or probably maybe in prison, right? I got invited to Harvard, not at the business school, but at the Center for Human Flourishing. Because that's really what entrepreneurial thinking is all about. It's about human flourishing. I now know that when a human being is encouraged to pursue her interests and develop her abilities autonomously in ways that are useful to other humans, she will flourish. That's not my over-caffeinated opinion. That's not a moral or philosophical or religious or a Western or Eastern thing. It's biology. Human beings are like acorns. They're no different than any other living thing. We're all born with the innate capacity and desire to become all that we can become. But that tendency can be easily thwarted by a constellation of cognitive, motivational, and situational factors of which we may not be aware. So what I've learned is that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. That we're all born curious. You know who wrote this? You're not going to believe this. Karl Marx. I learned more about entrepreneurship reading Marx. I'm not a Marxist, don't freak out, okay? But he wrote about this idea that the desire to fulfill human needs through our own ingenuity and efforts is an essential part of what makes us human. And then Maslow took it further 100 years later and said when that capacity is either suppressed or denied, we get sick. Sometimes immediately, sometimes later, sometimes in obvious ways, sometimes in non-obvious ways. Here's a fun fact. Do you know that 2/3 of students leave school not engaged in learning? Gallup's been tracking this for 25 years. They call it the engagement cliff. In 5th grade, 75% of the kids are engaged. And it just goes boom, 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 boom. By the time they get out of high school, only 1 in 3 are engaged in learning. Shouldn't that be going the other way? Shouldn't that be going up? Sometime in the future, maybe 100 years from now, maybe 200 years from now, hopefully not that long, we will look back on standardized education the way we now look back on surgery pre-anesthesia. Right? As barbaric and inhumane. And a lot of the research I did for my new book came from evolutionary psychology. And I studied the way humans have learned for 99% of the time we're on the planet. And it very closely resembles the way entrepreneurs learn. Right? It's an organic thing. And our job as leaders is to create the conditions that are conducive to that kind of learning. I also found out that 2/3 of workers are not engaged in their work. Right? North America, we are the most engaged in the world. And only 1 out of 3 is actively engaged in their work. Globally, it's worse. It's 87% are not engaged. The way one economist put it like this, there are 10 of us in a canoe. Right? 2 of us are paddling backwards, like we're actively disengaged, like hostile to the organization's goals. Seriously, Gallup's tracking all this, right? 2 are paddling backwards. 5 are kind of looking at their watch, flapping the paddles in the water, when is it, 5 o'clock, thank God it's Friday kind of thinking, And the other 3 are pulling the whole damn thing. When you look at entrepreneurial-minded people, they are optimally engaged. And it has nothing, maybe that's a little bit of, it has very little to do with their dispositional traits. And it has everything to do with their goal they're pursuing and their relationship to that goal. Now, I'm going to stop in a second. I'd like to engage with you guys in some dialogue, but part of what I learned is that it's Newtonian, right? That what we don't realize, we look at the entrepreneur, we say, man, that guy's just killing it, he's just on it, And what we don't realize is that it's the compelling nature of the goal is acting on the individual, right? So here's the compelling goal, here's the individual. The goal, in medieval physics, we thought, I'm going to take a rock and I'm going to throw it. I'm instilling energy in the rock, and the energy is going to dissipate and the rock's going to fall to earth, right? It's intuitive understanding of physics, but it's utterly incorrect. Newton came along and said that rock would go on forever, except for the fact that it's being acted upon by an invisible force called gravity. One of the questions I like to ask, specifically young people, is like, do you have a compelling goal? Do you have a clear vision? When you interview entrepreneurs, almost to a person, they will, early in the conversation, they will confess some sort of a compelling goal, something that has purpose and meaning, something they're trying to accomplish. They see something in the future they're trying to get to. You know what the literature says? It's called prospection theory. When our brains are oriented towards a positive future, our default mode in the brain is solving the problems while we're taking a shower, while we're sleeping, mowing the lawn. right? It enables us to access problem-solving abilities that are otherwise not available to us. The goal is acting on the individual. So, let me just kind of wrap up here. So the work we're doing now is redefining economic development. We're working with community stakeholders, philanthropists, nonprofit organizations, corporate sponsors to unlock the entrepreneurial potential in communities across the United States. And you know, the idea of creating entrepreneurial ecosystems has been around for a couple of decades, but most of them are bullshit. You know, I speak at these conferences all over the world, Rio de Janeiro, Moscow, Melbourne, and these ecosystem conferences, and they're all talking about venture capital, tech transfer, you know, these lofty terms. You know, there are 600,000 businesses created in the United States every year. A tiny fraction of 1% of those are started with venture capital. And meanwhile, we're overlooking all this untapped potential that's in ordinary people that we're overlooking. The city of Albuquerque came to us about 10 years ago, and they said, we want to train city government workers how to think like entrepreneurs. And I thought it was a prank phone call. Right? I mean, what's the opposite of an entrepreneur in your brain? Exactly. I'm like, I don't think that's a good idea, you know? And the mayor, Richard Berry, he was persistent, you know? And he said, let's just try it with 100 of employees. And I said, okay, fine. They put 100 randomly selected city government workers in the city of Albuquerque through our program. I mean, from the law director to the sanitation supervisor. The sanitation supervisor, I wrote about him in my book. He didn't want to be, he said, no, I'm not a classroom guy. His boss made him go. He got voluntold, right? He said, I'm sitting in the back of the classroom with my arms folded. I'm trying to let the instructor know I don't want to be here, right? You guys have seen that movie before, right? And so he said, like, you know, a couple days into it, he was like, whoa, wait a minute. The taxpayers are our customers. I have a team, like, we can solve problems. And he started to get the other sanitation workers, like, what problems can we solve? They were losing $40 a ton on recyclables. Now they're making $10 a ton, right? That untapped potential is in people. I did some work with Morgan Freeman's wife in a maximum security prison with 120 inmates who are never going to see the light of day. Life without parole. Dr. Linda Keener from the University of Mississippi, she took our Ice House program in prison. I said, Linda, what the hell are you doing? She's trying to do restorative justice. How do you do that with people that have killed people, you know? She said, you got to come down here. So I flew in, you know, they live in Oxford, and I flew in, and, you know, she meets me at the gas station and hands me a bag of gas station chicken. I didn't know that was a thing. And we go to this prison, and, you know, and it was Shawshank. It was Shawshank. Whatever you think about, that's what it was. Intimidating as hell. I spent a day with these guys in a prison. There was 120 of them. They had gone through the Ice House entrepreneurship program. They had raised $22,000 to package meals that would feed starving kids in Africa. And all day we were in this prison like an assembly line, scooping up, you know, a scoop of this, a scoop of that, put it in a bag, weighing it, sealing it in the box, and boom, 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 boom. By 3 o'clock, we had packaged 100,000 meals that would feed 250 kids for a year. And they wheeled out a television screen on a cart, you know, in this room, and it wasn't much bigger than this room, a little bigger than this room. And they showed a video of a kid before and after, a little kid emaciated, his belly's descended, he's just sitting there in a mud puddle and flies all over him. And they show the same kid a year later after he's received the aid. And he's got a school uniform on, he's bouncing around in the schoolyard, you know. And I'm standing in this room with 120 inmates. And half of those guys are crying like little babies. Right? that desire. One guy came up to me, and he had his copy of the Ice House book, and he's looking at me, like not trying to intimidate me, but he got up on me, and he said, you got to get these ideas in the minds and the hands of the kids so they don't get up in here like I did, right? That's the work we're doing. To unlock the entrepreneurial potential in people and places that have been overlooked or ignored. Whether it's in rural communities, urban communities. There's a nonprofit organization in North Carolina called NC Idea. It's run by a friend of mine who's from Cleveland, Tom Rue. He was at the Kauffman Foundation for a while. He purchased 100,000 licenses of Ice House. Carpet bombed the state. Middle school, high school, community college, four-year universities, nonprofits, workforce development. Trained 400 champions to take these ideas out in the community. Carpet bombed the state. You know that North Carolina is now the #1 entrepreneurial state in the United States. And what he's doing is people now he created this hyper-localized network of entrepreneurial communities, investing in everyday entrepreneurs. And by the way, they're in the middle, smack dab in the middle of the research triangle, where all the venture-backed high-growth stuff's happening, right? They provide micro grants for people to come forward, give them a little bit of support and mentoring, and get them going. Off they go. The governor of North Carolina just published a report showing that increasing by 5% the number of small firms that get to sustainability, which the governor of North Carolina described as somewhere between 50 and 100,000 in top-line revenue. That's a low bar. You could do that with a lawnmower or a squeegee, right? By increasing the number of those little firms by 5%, creates 25,000 new jobs and generates between $1.5 and $2 billion of annual economic impact in the state of North Carolina. I'm working with a former felon who's taken these ideas, gone into urban communities in South Central Los Angeles, in Colorado Springs, in Kansas City, he's now in North Omaha, going in the hood. And he's got story after story after story about gangbangers and single moms lifting themselves out of poverty, stabilizing their families, and then passing it on to their kids, right? I'm working with an organization in Kansas, Network Kansas, doing the same in rural communities. That's the work we're doing. If there's any interest in this room, why we're not doing this in Cleveland is beyond me. Jumpstart's a great organization, but they're looking for the high growth, high potential. There's nothing here in Cleveland to support the everyday entrepreneur. So I'm going to shut up. Happy to take questions, happy to engage in dialogue. I hope I've convinced you to buy a copy of either one of my books. You can find them wherever books are sold. I have hardcover, this isn't out in softcover yet, but Audible, whatever. So that's my story. I'm going to stick with it. Happy to take questions.
So I'm curious, I mean, you've talked about all the things that you've done and you're experiencing and lifting people up. So what are maybe the top 2, 3 things? And I understand optimism. What are some of the top 2, 3 things that you emphasize, push, teach?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there's so much myth and misunderstanding around the word entrepreneur. You say that word, people think, oh, I got to invent something and I need venture capital and I got to take big risks. I got to quit my job. I got to put my family in financial risk and all that stuff. And it's just really a myth. And the data show that, by the way, that entrepreneurs are actually more risk averse than non-entrepreneurs. So the idea of the entrepreneur as the big risk taker is also kind of a myth. But I think the number one thing, and that's why our program is so effective, because we're redefining entrepreneurship in a way that's accessible. And when people see examples, what I would call, like what a psychologist would call relatable social models, when I can see people who come from similar or worse circumstances than I did, succeeding in this domain, I'm all in. If we just look at the entrepreneur as the one in a 10,000, it's kind of like studying lottery winners if you want to understand financial literacy, right? So I think that's the most important thing. I looked at the definition of entrepreneurship, and it bugs me because it's antiquated, right? The word entrepreneur arose at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Why? Because it was the first time in human history we needed a word that would distinguish the person who organized and operated the business from a person who worked in it. And I'm arguing that distinction is vaporizing in front of our very eyes. That the person who works in a business now needs to think more or less as if they own it, and if they don't, they're going to be in trouble. But I looked at the definition, somebody who takes a risk in exchange for a profit. I've not seen evidence of that. Almost every single entrepreneur I've ever interviewed has some kind of a purpose-driven component to their work. And to characterize them as strictly profit-driven is a mischaracterization, misunderstanding. I looked at Howard Stevenson's definition of entrepreneurship as Harvard professor emeritus. He defined entrepreneurship as the pursuit of opportunities without regard for resources currently controlled. It's like, what the hell does that mean, right? It's just clunky and clinical. But I built on that and I said, you know what? Entrepreneurship is the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. And that's what I learned from Uncle Cleve at the Ice House.
Say that again.
Entrepreneurship is the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. The entrepreneurs that fail are the ones that are thinking about themselves. That's the message from the Ice House. You're going to miss opportunities every day, all day, because you're thinking about getting your own needs met. So that's my definition. So I got a second part of the definition, though. It's the self-directed pursuit of opportunity to create value for others. It's about the other. You guys know who David Morgenthaler was? I interviewed him back in 2009 or something like that. And you know what he told me sitting up in his office in the Terminal Tower drinking a Diet Coke? He said, the world doesn't give a shit about what you like to do. Right? But the second half of my definition is by solving problems for others, we empower ourselves. And I don't just mean economically, I mean we empower ourselves through optimal engagement. We empower ourselves by pursuing our interests and developing our abilities autonomously in ways that create value. And to younger people in the room, what I would say is, what's preventing you from making yourself more useful to more humans? It's a question you should ask yourself every day. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll try to be less long-winded on the answers.
Do you think, you talked to a lot of university schools, do you think they're doing a better job teaching entrepreneurship now? Or more opportunity to teach kids in college, and there's more entrepreneurship classes or programs available to them certainly than when I was?
They all suck. I'm in the middle of writing an article right now called Academia is Where Entrepreneurship Goes to Die. And there are myriad reasons for this. But first of all, I gave a talk at a conference while I was in Cameroon, Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon. And the Minister of Education standing up there going blah, blah, blah with a slide with every square inch filled with text. And it dawned on me, like, you know what, college is too late. It's too late. You don't start training soccer players when they're 19 years old to play professional soccer, do you? No. Right, we got to start training people. You know, I was asked to give a talk at a local college who will remain nameless. I think there's alumni in the room, though. Hint, hint, hint. And they wanted me to give a talk to their entrepreneurship program. One of their star students was making cutting boards. And I'm thinking to myself, this is 7th grade entrepreneurship. Making cutting board, like that's rudimentary, that's entrepreneurship like for children. And what about the parents of that kid? How does a parent feel? I'm paying $160,000 for my kid to learn how to make cutting boards? I don't think so, right? But there's other factors that are happening. You know, the parents are paying for this education. They want the diploma. They want the degree. I was given a talk. I'm working with a group of deans at the University of Western Georgia. They understand that they're going to become irrelevant if they don't change the way they're doing business. And I was saying to the group of deans, this is 2 weeks ago, I said, let's do a thought experiment. Let's pretend you're the president of University of Western Georgia, and you're speaking to the class of 2027, rising juniors. And you're going to say to them, boys and girls, today is your lucky day. We're going to hand out your diploma 2 years early. You don't have to come back if you don't want to. We think you should, but you don't have to come back if you don't want to. How many kids are coming back in the fall? Right? Did you know that this is the problem, that these kids are not, they're motivated by extrinsic rewards. The research is very, very clear on this. Extrinsic rewards or threat of punishment undermine intrinsic motivation, which is the most potent form of motivation known to man.
Are you saying you're not supportive of participation prizes?
I'm not. I mean, there's some value in rewarding the behavior to signal, right? But I think like these pitch competitions are also, most people that are teaching entrepreneurship are doing so through a managerial lens. They don't know it. And that's one of the big ideas that came out in my book, is that in anthropology, like Anthropology 101 is, you can't understand another culture until you recognize that you're looking at the world through your own cultural lens. The entrepreneurial mindset only seems mysterious to us because we're steeped in managerial culture. And the values of managerial culture are industrial era relics, right? What are those assumptions? The useful thing has already been established by somebody else. We don't want you to have useful thing discovery skills because they get in the way. Right? They're top-down, they're other-directed, they're error-reducing paradigms because they're focused on efficiency. And we need that. I'm not denigrating it. But that way of thinking used to be sufficient. You could go to your job and go through your whole life in a career and retire with a gold watch, and that was good. But managerial paradigms, because they are focused on efficiency, these underlying assumptions that are rooted in essentially efficiency, replication efficiency, they're intolerant of exploration and experimentation. Entrepreneurial paradigms are error-inducing paradigms. Lots of little mistakes. Yes, Ben?
Yeah, I'm wondering, I think I'm resilient and optimistic, and sometimes I credit that to my parents and my upbringing. If I think about it, that's what I would credit it to. Now, with the average person, is there an entrepreneur in everyone? or what is it that can, let the entrepreneur that there is, and some are all people go. What is it?
Yeah. I get that question a lot, Ben. And very often it's framed with a little less humility. Not everybody can do what I do, And the way I would answer that is this, it's really hard to start and run a business. It's not. But everybody's capable of being innovative and entrepreneurial. So let's just broaden the definition to say that.
Okay. The thought that's running through my head, that was a perfect setup. Because, so I'm running a paint factory, and there's Bob, who works out in the paint factory, and he's filling buckets all day long. And you can't run a paint factory if you don't have Bob. But Bob spends his weekends as a Civil War reenactor. So I don't know what he's thinking about while he's filling buckets, because I couldn't do that job for more than an hour without going crazy. But he must be spending all week thinking about how he's going out this weekend to live in the gray or blue flannel or whatever, and then canvas tent and cook his beans over in a cast iron pot. That's where his entrepreneurial mindset is.
Sure, yeah.
And then the interesting thing is, I'm not trying to but you got these people in your company who have these personal interests that are not necessarily revenue generating, or not necessarily, what was your other comment about producing value for other people?
Yeah. They're useful.
They themselves are doing these things that we call them hobbies or whatever, and they are totally into them and totally innovative about things like one guy's a canoe racer, another guy was an expert on guns and ammo and ballistics and all this other crazy stuff, and then there's guy's a hunter, and then they have all of these things that they do that they're very innovative. My frustration is, well, why don't you come to work and bring some of that innovation into your own?
So that's my work.
Yeah.
Because like the city of Albuquerque, there's entrepreneurial potential in the people that are working for it. It's our responsibility as leaders to understand how to create the conditions to make it more conducive.
I like to think I've laid out the conditions, but
Yeah.
they're so busy thinking about their weekend. And I don't mean that in a negative way, right? Because I gotta have Bob fill the bucket.
Sure. It's not really related to your comment, but I was giving a talk in Denver some years ago, and a CEO said to me, raised his hand and said, well, what if I train my people to think like entrepreneurs? They'll all leave. And I said to him, well, what if you don't and they all stay? You know what I mean? It's like, you can take this however you want, but there's entrepreneurial potential. The entrepreneurial spirit is the human spirit. It's not just in some of us, it's in all of us. There's research that shows that employees that have side hustles are more productive in their day job.
Yeah.
Right?
I was thinking about this idea of, because there's a lot of people that's a good thing for them, right? He fills his buckets, he goes home, he doesn't worry about making payroll and all that other crap, because he's got a family, he's taking care of his responsibilities, and that's good. But I was thinking about, this is not, almost like there's two kinds of entrepreneurship. There's what you said before about the idea of, it's not easy to start a business and make it grow. It's a very difficult thing to do, as opposed to a dependency mentality, right? Which is at least part of what I'm hearing you talk about is, and the need to start, you gotta start early. You don't train soccer players at 19 to play, world-class soccer. So, from my own personal experience, I grew up in Euclid, and one of 6 kids. My parents were blue-collar people.
What street?
East 280th Street, Lakeshore Boulevard.
Ellesmere Drive. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, and my parents were blue-collar people. A plumber and a nurse, and they busted their butts to try and just keep everything going. And I knew 2 people growing up that didn't work for someone else. They didn't punch a clock, right? My uncle down the street, who was an attorney at a small firm, did wills and probate and stuff like that. And the guy across the street, who I cut his lawn and I shoveled his driveway, he had a machine shop. right? And it was like, how's that? I mean, it was foreign. It was complete. And so it wasn't until I got to college that I met people that's like, there's like a whole different culture out there. This kid, the kid that was in my freshman class, he came to school in a Ferrari. His father, they lived next door to Robert Redford in New Jersey. You know, it's like what is this all about? So I mean, the concept of like how does it work and risk mentality and not being
It's a simple.
being fearful of like, you know, that's ingrained early. I think, you know.
You know, it goes back to, I think, your question. I can maybe tie these two things together. But I think that all entrepreneurial behavior arises from some level of dissatisfaction with the status quo.
Or a dramatic circumstance. You're kind of put in a challenging
And
spot.
to Bob on the, you know, filling paint buckets, if like that's fulfilling for him, you know, no pun intended, if that's getting it for him, he's well paid and he feels satisfied and cared for, like, fine, keep doing it. I make no judgment, I have no truck with that. It's like, but if he's unhappy, I want him to know he's got choices. That's my point. Right? And exposing people to these stories, like of everyday entrepreneurs, that's my mission, right?
Yeah, or a more extreme version of this whole thing is, you know, there's a lot of young people today, people in general, but young people in particular, who are on medications, psychiatric medications, because the world is making them feel bad.
One of my advisors was at Harvard, Tony Wagner. He's written a number of books about criticizing education, from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He said to me, I forgot the number, it's a big number, it was at least 40% of the students at Harvard are on some kind of antidepressants. It's crazy. It's like, you know, William Deresiewicz is a English professor at Yale, wrote a book called Excellent Sheep. About these, you can figure it, you can fill in the blanks there. These kids are programmed, and Jonathan Haidt, who's written about this also extensively from NYU, like invasive parenting.
Oh yeah.
You know, these kids have never figured out how to settle a score on the baseball field themselves. Parents are always jumping in. They're going from, they're always being controlled what to go this curricular, extracurricular, and they wind up in college. They'll jump through the hoops for you, but they have no idea who they are. They're racked with anxiety. Yes, sir.
Have you ever interviewed entrepreneurs who became entrepreneurs because they couldn't find a job?
Oh yeah, yeah. And you know, it sort of irritates me sometimes. Like people, you know, try to make a distinction between what they call a necessity entrepreneur or an opportunity entrepreneur, and they're trying to figure out, like, don't bother with the necessity entrepreneur. Focus on the opportunity-seeking entrepreneur. And I think that's also bullshit. Because look, it's farming. Some of those necessity entrepreneurs become high-growth entrepreneurs, right? It's farming, it's not big game hunting. So, but to come at your question a little bit differently, what I learned from studying these everyday entrepreneurs is that the adversity is working to their advantage. The lack of available resources causes them to micro-experiment, to try lots of little things on a small scale, and that's how they tease out opportunities that others overlook. The opportunity is latent. You can't find it with a spreadsheet and Google search and a business plan. Pardon my French, you gotta fuck around and find out, right? They don't quit their day jobs, they don't mortgage their house, they reappropriate discretionary time and effort out on the edges, experimenting. And it's not because they're risk mitigation specialists, it's because they don't have money. They're trying lots of things on a small scale, right? And what's funny is, when you kind of zoom out a little bit, they're following the scientific method. Right? It's not gambling. It's an evidence-based process. It's not a pitch competition with the opinion of somebody else. It's science. And one of the things I wrote about in the book about the entrepreneurial process is like the first trick of entrepreneurship is not to fool yourself. And you're the easiest person to fool. So you have to balance that enthusiasm and hubris with a little bit of humility and some critical thinking. That's the key to survival. But the lack of resources in that discovery phase, the attitudes and skills required to discover opportunities are entirely distinct from those required to exploit an opportunity. Like understanding, that's why entrepreneurship programs don't work, because they don't understand that distinction. They treat a startup as if it's a smaller version of a large corporation.
Let's have one more question, and then hopefully we'll.
Yeah, I'm happy to hang out.
My question is, it seems like, going out on your own is a nonconformist act. And to what degree is nonconformity, is it imbued in someone who becomes their own business owner or not?
Well, again, like I don't, the trait-based theories don't hold up, right? So what causes you to deviate from familial, from, cultural, from social norms, right? Some dissatisfaction with the status quo. And I was just saying to first thing I would do if I was an entrepreneur is create a support network of people. Put yourself in a room with people that are smarter, richer, more successful than you. Entrepreneurs will help other entrepreneurs, right? But we don't do that because our default mechanism is to surround ourselves with people that think and act like we do. I read Ben Franklin's biography a few years ago, about 5 years ago, and I created what he called it a junto group. I did it on Zoom. I created a group of scholars and big thinkers and entrepreneurs from all over the world. We meet every Monday at 3 o'clock. I made sure I'm the dumbest guy in the room, right? And now these people are my friends. I went to them scared. Hey, would you join this group? Here's what we're doing. Huh? Not everyone accepted, but I created a circle of, it's how I got invited to Harvard. So.
Yeah, let me step in. I wanted to pick up on one idea that Gary threw out, and he mentioned it to me before, that maybe we can, get something going locally. And so I'd invite any of you that are interested in participating in that effort.
I gave a talk at Cozy last week. I was thinking about going to Cozy and see if we could, get some sponsors, get Sherwin-Williams or somebody or Progressive to sponsor, the data's clear. Like supporting everyday entrepreneurs pays off. It's not something we do as a feel good. That's not what this is about. It's an economic impact hiding in plain sight. Sorry.
Yeah, no, so anybody who's interested maybe in that effort, reach out to me or to Gary. And if you reach out to me, then you and me will be in touch with Gary. I wanted to, Gary, hopefully you'll stick around for a few minutes.
Sure.
Okay, and I hate cutting it off. It's one of my responsibilities, so it has to be done. Let's have a round of applause for Gary.
Thank you.